Welcome to the second installment of this economic speaker series titled Looking Beyond Economic Growth. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Nolan, Senior Lecturer in Economics at the University of Hull. Dr. Nolan has written several papers on topics such as welfare policies and the North-South divide, amongst many others. Dr. Nolan, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day for this discussion.
That's no problem.
So let's get straight into the topic at hand, economic growth. It's arguably the most important long-term macroeconomic objective from a government level, and many in our audience who have taken GCSE or A-level economics will know that it's usually the first macroeconomic objective that's taught. However, I think the story behind the objective is nearly as important as the objective itself. So just to start off with, where did our obsession with economic growth come from? And where did measuring economic growth come about?
Well, the issue of the size of economies is something which I guess has mattered since economies themselves existed, and in other words, since individual countries might look at their performance, might look at what they were producing as a country, and they would have to have some sort of method of gauging how well they were doing. And I guess a key issue here about economic growth that we have to remember is that growth is talking about change. Okay, it's talking about how the economy is changing through time. Okay, so just to be very clear on the point, it's possible for an economy which is quite small to grow quite quickly. Okay, so you could have high economic growth whilst actually not being a very large economy. And similarly, when you are a very large economy, it can indeed actually sometimes be quite hard to grow quickly. So economic growth is key, but we have to keep in mind the background, which is that it's also about what the starting point is. Now, quite rightly, you mentioned about economic growth as a sort of long-term objective. And that is because as you accumulate that economic growth, that change, hopefully you're looking always for positive economic growth, therefore to increase the size of the economy, over a long period with that positive economic growth, you will clearly make the overall economy still larger. Now, in terms of measuring the economic growth, then you come up against one or two other important issues, because if you're going to make comparisons between different countries, you have to consider whether they're able to measure the size of their economy, measure their performance, measure their economic growth in the same way, in a comparable manner. How are they collecting their data? How exactly is it represented? Now, as time has gone on, it has become possible probably to have more similarity in the way in which data are collected and represented. But nonetheless, we should keep in mind, in particular, that often less developed countries, where their economies as a whole are less well developed, are often also less well developed in the way in which they collect their economic data and they represent their economic data. Therefore, again, it's just necessary to be a little bit careful about the validity of the measurements that are going on, and thus also, to some extent, the comparability of those measurements.
So I think an interesting thing you talked about was, the fact that economic growth is a measure of size. That's predominantly what it is. It measures how much an economy is producing within a given period of time, and therefore this is a measure of how big an economy is. However, over time, I believe we've extrapolated the definition of economic growth to include economic development, and so this link is being made between higher economic growth and higher economic development. And so my question to you is, how strong is this correlation, and is it linear? In other words, if we continue to have higher and higher economic growth, does that necessarily guarantee higher and higher living standards and higher economic development for a country?
Okay, so as far as consistent high economic growth is likely to lead to an economy becoming significantly larger over a period of time. Now, this is maybe one of those areas where the economic term ceteris paribus might sometimes be used, in the sense that you said, other things being equal, ceteris paribus, that would tend to mean living standards would be higher. However, the reality is, of course, that other things are not always equal, and we know that in actual countries and over actual periods of time, that's not the case. So, for example, we have to keep in mind the issue of how the productive capacity of a country, the size of the economy, is actually distributed among the different people within the country. So, for example, it might be possible for an overall economy to be large, but with a very unequal distribution, that wealth, if you like, or that income in particular, might be concentrated in relatively small sections of the population, and therefore the living standards, possibly of the majority, might be suffering. And by the same token, an economy which is enjoying more modest economic growth, by having a good deal of equality in the distribution of the fruits of that growth, might see higher living standards. So there's an issue there straight away, even measuring the economic growth in traditional terms by measures of income or output, what we call gross domestic product or some measure such as that. We can, of course, then take things further and say that measures of economic performance, economic growth, which only relate to income and output, are potentially only incomplete measures. We have to also consider what sort of productive capacity is being realized in these economies. It's possible to produce particularly goods, I suppose, more so than services would have some of these effects, but some of these goods may have negative connotations. Some people might suggest that producing a very high overall output, which relates a lot, for example, to weapons for warfare, might not necessarily be a good thing. Equally, if you're producing very high output at the cost of high levels of pollution, great amounts of congestion, these may be rather negative, and the actual living standards that individuals are likely to enjoy may be significantly compromised.
So I think you hit on some points where we've discussed how economic growth isn't the magical indicator of economic development. Like you say, there are many other factors that go into that come into play when we're trying to determine how economically developed a country is. And I think this is something we'll touch on a little bit later. But you talked about how solely income-based measures of economic development seem to be incomplete. Are there any other indicators or other developments in the economic field being made to produce more complete measures of economic development?
Well, certainly having a measure such as the Human Development Index, or indeed the Sustainable Development Index, both of those are potential alternatives which offer additional dimensions. So income then is not the only dimension that would potentially be targeted through good performance in those index measures. So there might be aspects which relate to life expectancy, for example. That would be one aspect which it might seem reasonably sensible to target good performance in. And indeed, I suppose you could moderate that life expectancy measure also by the quality of the life that people have. So it's life in good health, for example. And in addition to that, you might think in terms of education. Okay, so education is another aspect which would be seen as a positive, and therefore in a Human Development Index, you want to see alongside income and life expectancy, widespread and growing amounts of education across the population. Similarly, in terms of sustainability, it might be necessary to consider the knock-on effects of the economic development in terms of, for example, CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, which can have negative aspects for potentially global warming or other negative climate developments, aspects which may make life in a longer term on Earth less sustainable. So those sorts of things need to be avoided. Development needs to take place in a sustainable way that will not compromise the fundamental resource that the Earth itself represents.
Going back to this idea of augmenting economic growth with other factors that contribute to economic development, and by doing this, we get HDI and SDI, like you mentioned. But going back to what you said right at the start, was that some low-income countries may not have the means to actually go out and measure these other impacts. And so could you say that one of the reasons why GDP has become so popular over time is that it's a relatively simple measurement and it doesn't require all the extra steps that measuring HDI or measuring SDI would need? So, some countries don't post labor force survey figures because the actual process of measuring these indicators is too expensive and too unfeasible for these countries. And so is that one of the reasons why GDP has become so popular?
The process of collecting data in itself is potentially, in some regards, both expensive, time-consuming, and potentially subject to technical difficulties. So in order to undertake it reliably, there are certain aspects of measurement which may be more tricky to actually put into practice. So I think there's a fair measure of truth in what you suggest when you say that income is highly tangible, typically, and therefore relatively easy to put your finger on, relatively easy to define and to therefore measure effectively. I would perhaps just want to sound one or two notes of caution to go with that, though, also, just in the sense that what gets measured as part of traditional national income and what does not get measured is something which occasionally gets missed. So there are certain aspects of an economy and the economic activity that goes on which just might not be measured at all. Now, traditionally, one aspect here might have been at least aspects of the so-called underground economy, where unofficial activity is going on without proper regulation and possibly without any sort of legality in some instances. And when that's going on, of course, you've got a real question that you should have in your mind as to whether two different countries, which are similar apart from one having this activity and the other not having it, how would you like that to be measured? Shouldn't there be a reflection of that activity? Then there is also perhaps a question about certain unpaid forms of activity. And now traditionally, a lot of this might have been happening with household working. So where two or more adults were in a household situation, there might be quite a lot of productive activity, which is unpaid, but which is clearly of economic value, and which, because it's unpaid, tends to fall outside of the calculation of national income. Now, I do know with regard to the other aspect I mentioned, aspects about the value of the underground economy, there have been some efforts to try to measure in more recent times. But again, going back to your point about different countries and about the difficulty of measurement, clearly that's a challenge which some countries may be better resourced to investigate than others.
So what's the impact of actually missing out these key parts, key components of national income? So you talked about the underground economy and certain forms of unpaid work. I'm thinking childcare is an example of that. But what's the negative impact of this? Is there any reason why a country should go about pursuing the calculations of these forgotten sides of the economy, or is it not that important?
Well, to be clear, there is an aspect of this which is inevitably a little bit subjective in terms of what you decide the level of importance of this is. However, the overarching objective that a country might reasonably have to try to see how well is it performing. So both from its own point of view, in the context perhaps of how it was performing previously, having targets for the future, but also trying to set itself in context with how it might be performing relative to other countries, and to target policy which government might reasonably take up. There is a lot to be said for trying to get a complete picture rather than a picture which has significant chunks left out. If you leave those chunks out, the outcome may be that your policies will simply be a reflection of what you have chosen to include, and by missing out important aspects, you may leave, for example, childcare issues on the sidelines of your policy, and you may end up coming then to regret that when you realise that there might be a significant issue, there might be issues of discrimination, there might be issues of how to allocate or how to ensure that that childcare takes place effectively, which by failing to measure that aspect of the economy, you've not really got a handle on how you should be intervening, what the size of the issue is, and how you might look to solve it.
And now, looking at the present with the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, well, specifically with COVID-19, we've seen around the world that countries ranking highly in terms of GDP, so I'm thinking the US, the UK, and these countries are some of the worst affected by COVID-19. In your opinion, does this show that economic growth is a flawed measure of economic development, given that the UK is the largest economy in the world? Surely the fact that it has the most COVID-19 deaths by a long shot is jaw-dropping.
Well, for the US to have a lot of cases, firstly, I mean, it's not entirely unexpected in the sense that, for example, the US has a fairly substantial population of about 330 million. Now, that may not be by any means the largest, but it's definitely one of the larger populations in the world. So it's not altogether surprising that they've got lots of cases. I think with the specific case of this COVID-19 pandemic, we also have to keep in mind at the moment we're still in the relatively early stages, in the sense that we're in sort of the series of first waves, and we have to keep in mind that the process takes a particular path, in some sense is a geographical path around the world. And so, I think we probably need to wait in order to make a definitive judgment. However, having said that, there's no doubt that the US, for example, but the UK as well, and a number of other European countries which would be considered very well developed, have all been hit very hard. Now, in part, it's possible that this can be linked to mobility, because with the spread of a virus, you have to consider that when you're having many people moving from country to country, it's easier to spread the virus in that way. Also, you have to keep in mind aspects such as population density. Now, to be fair, in the case of the United States, large swathes of the United States are not particularly densely populated, but of course it does have some large cities that definitely are densely populated. There are also issues in this particular instance about the distribution of people of different ages. The age distribution of the population has to be taken into account, because this is a virus which is much more deadly to older members of the population. So if you have a population, and just by the way, one of the early relatively severely hit countries was Italy, and they've got quite an aging population, and they were hit quite hard. So I think we have to keep in mind these different aspects. Another aspect is policy response. So different governments have adopted different measures, or if not even different measures, different timings at which they impose particular measures. So a lot has been talked about lockdown. Okay, lockdown, in other words, shutting down large areas of the economy, large aspects of the country, which can have a very damaging economic effect if it's sustained, but also may be necessary to kind of stop the virus in its tracks. If you do that sufficiently early, you can perhaps keep the numbers of deaths a lot lower. If you are even modestly late in doing that, because the growth of cases tends to follow what's called an exponential growth path, it grows very, very rapidly, and you can get a lot more cases and, in the way of things, a lot more deaths as a consequence of postponement of lockdown. And there may be aspects of that which have contributed in some of these cases, at least. It's something which has been levelled against the UK government as to, did they lock down the economy and the country maybe a week late, and did that double the death toll that we've seen so far?
And now looking to the other big crisis of our time, the climate crisis, there are arguments that economic growth is leading to worsening measures of biodiversity and sustainability, and most of all, air pollution. And my question to you is, there have been calls for sustainable growth and governments going out to achieve sustainable growth. So taking into account these other factors, how would a government physically go about firstly measuring sustainable growth, and secondly, how do you think a government should go about actually implementing policy to achieve sustainable growth?
Well, I think, to be fair, there have been some moves towards sustainable growth in some countries already. And I think it was probably, for example, just earlier on during the current COVID-19 crisis for the UK, there was a statement about there will be a particular period of time during which coal will not have been used to generate electricity for the UK. And this will have been the longest continuous period without using coal. Now, coal is a fossil fuel and is implicated significantly, I think, in potential difficulties with higher greenhouse gas content, and thus climate change. So I think there are certain moves which have been going on. So moving away from coal, although of course haven't moved away sufficiently yet perhaps from gas and oil, and fully perhaps towards renewable sources of energy. But those things, to some extent, have shown signs of being, of happening. And it is possible to move in that direction. Initially, when some of these renewable sources of energy were started, they were seen as very, very expensive. So seen as very expensive to generate electricity using, for example, wind power. Now, what was done initially was there were subsidies provided by government to encourage that process to get underway. What has happened since is that the technology has improved, and therefore the unit costs associated with that renewable energy have gone down. That makes it more competitive, and it makes it a more natural outcome that the mix of energy generation moves in the direction of these greener sources. So that probably points the way to one of the paths towards a greener future, just as also making polluters make a genuine payment for the damage that they may be creating, these so-called negative externalities that they're imposing on essentially others and the general environment. If you have systems of permits, if you have taxes, if you have other incentive mechanisms there, what you can do is generate some changes in behavior, and therefore you should get some changes in outcome. Now, of course, you can argue, have we gone about this with enough vigor? Have we done it quickly enough? Are we moving fast enough towards where we need to be? And there's clearly indications in some of what's actually happening. Again, in terms of, if you look at global temperatures, you can see that we're probably seeing upward trends there, which are worrying, and which at least raise the question, if we don't act more decisively and rather quickly, might we see significant further difficulties, damage, which will be seen by things like heat waves, which can create higher death tolls, and melting of Arctic ice, by which you can then end up with rising sea levels and inundations of major cities, and indeed potentially cities like Hull.
I think it's also important to state that some of the policies that you suggested, such as the carbon tax, that there's a real danger that these could become regressive, and so lower income households could be the most affected by these policies in a negative manner. And so my question to you is, how do we ensure that we continue this transition to a sustainable economy, a green economy, without inflicting these regressive punishments on lower income households which may not have the means to buy green and to buy goods with lower carbon footprint?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible indeed to probably even take that take the argument still further and move it up onto a more macro level, and to suggest that perhaps it's easier for highly developed economies which have relatively high incomes already as countries to afford these green developments more than less developed countries who are still looking to catch up on some of the sorts of development that perhaps other countries have had in either past decades or indeed past centuries. So in a sense, you're quite right to point out that potential difficulty. It isn't necessarily an insurmountable difficulty if there is an appetite to add to the policy of a general incentivization for green development, further measures which might target support, again, looking at incentives and looking at the reality of people's circumstances, to say, okay, perhaps there are some people who are going to need, some households, some industries that might need greater support in order to get them, at the very least, on the initial stages of this ladder. So by providing, you can provide certain payments and subsidies. Now, clearly, there's a decision to make. This is a, if you like, a policy choice. Do you just leave them to it, in which case you might have these regressive effects which you identified, or do you say, well, we're going to adopt a sort of broader perspective on this, look at the overall situation and say a package of measures is necessary whereby people who are in genuine need and genuine difficulty are going to be supported to allow them, so to enable them to participate without really feeling the negative effects that you've described. And therefore, hopefully, and it's not just about, if you like, pure charity or pure just giving money away for the sake of it. This, remember, is also about very much long-term development. And it's about saying where we do not perhaps want to be, which is in some sort of awful future where climate change were to run out of control, in which case it's not just one set of people who would be feeling the effects of that, and possibly to a very great extent, in other words, talking about people not being able to carry on living in a given place, or having higher death rates from various climate catastrophes. So it's about everybody being able to exist into the future in a sustainable way. And I suppose this is what sustainable development as an idea is really about.
And now, looking to the future, there are some calls to go beyond economic growth and almost do away with it, moving to systems such as gross national happiness, as they've adopted in Bhutan, or ideas of having a mission-based system for government objectives. And so these would be potential alternatives to using economic growth as a measure of economic development. So what are your views on this?
Well, to sort of look at it sort of from a personal perspective, I suppose I would suggest that working solely off the size of an economy measured by GDP per head in real terms and economic growth is not really the whole story, as economics, to my way of thinking, would have it. Okay, so only thinking in those terms, it's an important dimension, yes, but it isn't the whole story. So I think it is necessary, if you want to adopt a broader economic perspective, to consider other dimensions, and potentially happiness could be one of those dimensions. And to be able to say that economies are doing well, if you've got a scenario where the economy is large and economic growth is significant, substantial, positive, and yet the people are unhappy and getting less happy, they're less and less satisfied with their lives, that suggests there's something quite fundamentally awry. And there is evidence of sustained periods of economic growth having happened in advanced countries over a period of several decades. So if you take, say, from the 1960s up, let's say, at least until the time of the financial crash in around 2007, 2008. So there was a lot of sustained growth going on as far as the traditional measure of economic performance was concerned, and yet people were not getting happier. So sometimes called Easterlin paradox. That suggests that there is something missing in what is being measured, and it suggests there is a need. We should perhaps be crying out to get something more, and perhaps happiness might offer this dimension. a caveat, a note of caution that's probably worth considering is, of course, happiness is not altogether straightforward to measure. Individuals may have a pretty good idea in their mind at times of whether they feel happy or not, but aggregating happiness across different individuals is something which a lot of people might not see as being entirely straightforward. So it's just a sort of note of caution. I think, the idea in principle is right, I think, but there may be some, again, this is back to some of the practical problems of measurement and the data. Okay, so what it would be good to do is to have something very much like that, but be able to get it measured in a way which can be agreed to be more robust, and that therefore people will accept. Whereas at the moment, I think one danger is you may find some people not very accepting of the measure, and therefore you're going to find problems when it comes perhaps to persuading policymakers to actually act on the basis of the additional dimension of the sort of target measure.
I completely agree with you. It seems as if the main issue with moving on from GDP is trying to fit these subjective principles like happiness into accessible, easy to understand, objective indicators that are easy to understand from a policymaker's perspective, because in the end, a policymaker uses these objectives to set out the path for the future of an economy. So yes, I think that's a good point on which to wrap up this discussion. We've discussed the history behind this important indicator, how it applies to current economic issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, and we've discussed what the future might bring for this traditionally crucial objective. Thank you very much, Dr. Nolan, for sharing your insightful perspectives on this.
Thank you.